The laughter was thunderous. The stage lights were blinding. Cameras clicked like a chorus of applause, and every eye was drawn to the man with a twinkle in his eye and 1,000 voices in his head. Robin Williams. He had just wrapped a stand-up set in Los Angeles that left the audience gasping for breath from laughter. The room buzzed with energy. Agents circled, producers gushed, and the press swarmed. He smiled, he bowed, and just like that, he disappeared. Not into the green room, not to a limo, but out the side door, through a quiet alley behind the club. Just him, a hoodie, and a breath of cool air. Because as much as he thrived in the spotlight, there was a part of Robin that always sought the shadows, the quieter corners of the world where people weren't seen or heard. He had seen too much pain hiding behind applause. He'd once said that the funniest people often carry the heaviest hearts. But unlike most, he didn't just carry his own, he carried others, too. That night, he walked down to a familiar corner of the city. Not the part on tourist maps, but a stretch where people wrapped themselves in old coats instead of red carpets. Some of them recognized him, not with shouts or selfies, but nods. Mutual respect. Like war veterans who didn't need to say much to know what the other had survived. Robin handed out food, quietly. No cameras, no announcements, just kindness. Sometimes he stayed to talk. Other times, he simply listened. To stories most people ignored, to names that had faded from IDs long ago. That was Robin, the man who could make millions roar with laughter, but always made time for one quiet voice in the dark. And yet, that wasn't the whole story. Not even close. What few people knew was that behind every movie, every tour, every big-budget production he was part of, there was another kind of casting happening. Unannounced, uncredited, but life-changing. The kind that started not on a stage or in a script, but in the hearts of people who had lost almost everything, and were given a chance by a man who saw more than talent. He saw humanity, and for one man with the world at his feet, that made all the difference. The production team was buzzing. Another Robin Williams tour was about to hit the road, and as usual, everything was running behind. Lighting rigs needed testing, sets weren't finished, and the backstage crew was scrambling to keep pace. But Robin was calm. He sat with a clipboard, reviewing something most stars never bothered with, a list of hires for the crew. His assistant leaned in and whispered, "We've got union workers lined up for all tech positions. Should I go ahead?" Robin shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "Let's open a few spots. Street hires." His assistant blinked. I mean, let's find a couple people who need this job more than they want it." It wasn't a new habit. From as early as the 90s, Robin had a quiet rule. Every project should include at least a few people who were struggling, really struggling, formerly homeless, recovering addicts. People society had sidelined. He didn't advertise it. He never made it part of some public image. But if you'd worked on one of his tours or films, you probably heard stories. Some dismissed them as legend. But the people whose names never made the credits? They knew the truth. One of them was a man named Kevin. Kevin had been living in a shelter for 6 months when a stranger walked in one day, smiling with a bag of takeout and asking about job training programs. The staff was confused. Who shows up to a shelter like that? Kevin was even more confused when, after a brief chat, the man said, "You look like you can run a forklift." "I used to," Kevin muttered, "before I lost everything." "Well," the man said, "how would you like to get back on it?" 2 weeks later, Kevin was on Robin Williams' touring crew, setting up stages in cities he'd never dreamed he'd visit. He got a fresh pair of boots, a room of his own, a paycheck. But more than that, he got dignity. And Robin? He never once treated him like charity. "I wasn't a project to him," Kevin later said. I was just part of the team. Robin's belief was simple. You don't lift someone up by pointing at their wounds. You lift them up by reminding them they still belong in the world. For Robin, comedy was healing, but so was action. So was showing up. So was saying, "You matter." Not with words, but with a job, a meal, a chance. That tour ran for 6 months. Kevin stayed for every city. And when it ended, he didn't go back to the shelter. He never had to. Because sometimes, one job changes one life. And Robin, he didn't need applause for that. Just knowing someone stood a little taller, that was enough. It was an unusual sight. Cameras rolled in Washington, D.C., but not for a film premiere or red carpet. The U.S. Senate was in session, and among the suited officials and solemn faces sat a man with wild eyes and restless hands. Robin Williams. The year was 1990. Congress was debating the McKinney Homeless Assistance Act, and Robin had asked to testify. Not perform. Testify. He sat at the table with a water bottle, a few notes scribbled on paper, and a sincerity that cut through every room he entered. He wasn't there as a comedian. He wasn't pitching a movie. He was pleading for a cause most powerful people avoided. "You can't keep picking people up," he said, voice steady. "You have to stop them from falling." It was quiet after that. No one laughed, no one interrupted, because everyone, even the most cynical senator, knew that he was speaking from experience. Not his own, but from what he'd seen in the alleys, under the bridges, behind the theaters. They listened because it wasn't policy for him. It was personal. In the months leading up to that testimony, Robin had made late-night visits to shelters in New York and San Francisco, walking in with coffee, conversation, and no press. He didn't go to observe. He went to listen. He wanted to know why people fell, what had broken, what had failed, what did they need, not what politicians thought they did. He heard stories of jobs lost after one missed paycheck, of medical bills that crushed entire families, of veterans left behind. And when the cameras finally pointed at him on Capitol Hill, he carried those stories like sacred truths. He told the senators something most stars never dared admit, that the difference between a man in a mansion and a man on a bench wasn't always effort or talent. Sometimes it was luck. Sometimes it was trauma. Sometimes it was just that no one had reached out in time. And while lawmakers debated bills and budgets, Robin's mission never changed. Give people a chance before they lose everything. That same week, while newspapers quoted his testimony, he was back in San Francisco, walking near Market Street with his son Zach. They passed a man sitting on the sidewalk with a sign that read, "Just hungry." Robin didn't hesitate. He sat down beside him. He asked his name. He asked about his story. Then he bought him a hot meal, gave him some cash, and stayed for nearly 30 minutes. Zach, watching from a few steps away, remembered that moment for the rest of his life. "He taught me," Zach would later say, "that kindness isn't about saving the world in one sweep. It's about being there, fully present, for the one person in front of you." And for Robin, that was the mission. On the Senate floor, on a movie set, or on a street corner. One person at a time. The film set was buzzing. Trailers lined the streets. Crew members moved like clockwork. Robin Williams was in the middle of shooting another blockbuster. Cameras followed his every movement. But behind the scenes, something else was quietly unfolding. Something few in the industry ever knew. Robin had a list. Not a list of VIPs, not a list of demands. A handwritten list of names, first names only. Scrawled in pen, sometimes in the margins of a notebook, sometimes on the back of his script. These names weren't actors or agents. They were helpers, people who had once been homeless, down on their luck, or overlooked by society. They had no resumes in Hollywood, no headshots, no representation, but what they had was Robin's trust. When production started, he'd hand that list to someone in casting or crew management and say something like, "Let's find them something. Anything. They just need the chance." Some were given jobs carrying equipment. Some managed props. Others worked in catering or security. And though they blended into the crowd, one thing was always clear. They knew exactly who had brought them there. Robin didn't parade them in front of the cameras. He didn't mention it in interviews. In fact, he often asked that no one say a word about it at all. But the people on that list? They remembered every second. One of them, a woman named Rosa, had once been living in her car with her 2 sons. She had cleaned diners, collected bottles, and applied for dozens of jobs, with no luck. Until one morning, someone knocked on her window. It was a production assistant. He handed her a card. "Robin Williams sent me," he said. "He remembers you from the shelter last winter. There's a job if you want it." Rosa ended up working as a set cleaner on a film for 3 months. It wasn't glamorous, but it was her first steady paycheck in years. And it gave her what she needed most, a safe place for her children. Years later, her son graduated from college, all because someone believed in her, not loudly, but deeply. Robin's list wasn't long, but each name was a world. Each name had a story. Each name was a spark that might have gone out, if someone hadn't protected it. And that was the thing about Robin. He made the world laugh, yes. But behind the curtain, he was doing something even more powerful. He was restoring dignity, quietly, consistently, without ever asking for thanks. And as that list grew, so did the impact, rippling across cities and families in ways no box office number could ever measure. Because when you give someone a job, you give them a meal. But when you give them a chance, you give them a future. After the cameras stopped rolling and the stage lights dimmed, there was always a moment Robin cherished most. Silence. Not the silence of loneliness, but the kind that wrapped around him when the world wasn't looking. In that quiet, he reflected on something he never talked about on talk shows, never posted on billboards, and never joked about in interviews. Legacy. Not the kind made of gold statues or record-breaking box office numbers, but the kind made of small ripples, unseen, unheard, yet unstoppable. Robin often said to close friends, "You don't get remembered for the laughs you gave strangers. You get remembered by the lives you helped rebuild." And he lived that belief. After his passing, stories began to emerge, not from celebrities or producers, but from janitors, former addicts, veterans, single mothers, and shelter volunteers. One by one, they stepped forward to share what no one knew. A man who'd lost everything in a fire, hired as a set driver. A woman escaping abuse, given a job in costume repair. A young veteran battling PTSD, invited to tour with the crew as part of the security team. None of them had agents. Most didn't even know who to thank at first. They only knew one thing. Robin saw them. He didn't see them as damaged or as problems to be solved. He saw them as equals, as worthy, as possible. His son, Zach, once said, "My dad didn't just believe in second chances. He believed in infinite ones." And the effects of those quiet decisions began to bloom long after Robin was gone. Children of those once homeless workers went on to attend college. Former addicts opened small businesses. Veterans who had been forgotten found purpose again. It wasn't flashy. It didn't trend on social media. But to those families, Robin Williams was more than a star. He was a turning point. Zelda, his daughter, shared a story that hit especially hard. At a comic relief event, she spoke of her father's insistence on always hiring at least one person who had experienced homelessness. Just one. That was his rule, because to him, even one life uplifted was a universe restored, and she made a plea to the industry. Do what he did. One person, one job. You don't have to change the whole world, just change theirs. Her voice broke as she said it, not from grief, but from pride. Because she wasn't just mourning a father. She was protecting a legacy not carved in marble, but in kindness. Years had passed. The world kept spinning, the entertainment industry moved on, and new stars filled theaters and headlines. But in quiet corners, behind stages, inside shelters, across dinner tables in humble homes, the light Robin Williams left behind never dimmed. It lived on, not in tributes or awards, but in conversations that began with, "You know, he changed my life." In San Francisco, a small community center launched a job training program for the homeless. Its founder, a former roadie who once toured with Robin, named it the Chance Room. His reason? Because Robin believed everyone deserved one. In New York, a once homeless man who had worked behind the scenes on a Robin film stood on stage at his daughter's graduation, tears streaming down his face. "Robin didn't just hire me," he told a friend nearby. "He gave my little girl a future." And in a dimly lit comedy club in Chicago, a young comic told a packed crowd, "My dream was to make people laugh like Robin did, but now my dream is to live like he did." Robin never got to see the full echo of his quiet kindness. He didn't wait for thank yous. He didn't keep track of the people he helped. He just helped. Because in the end, he understood something most people never learn, that the real power of wealth, fame, or talent is not in what it buys, but in who it lifts. And Robin Williams, the man who made the world laugh until it cried, spent his life making sure those with the quietest voices were heard, and those with the heaviest burdens felt, even for a moment, weightless. His children carry his spirit forward. Zach, who now speaks openly about mental health, often reminds audiences, "My dad was magic, but his greatest trick wasn't on stage, it was how he made people believe in themselves." And Zelda? She still tells the world that her father's real genius was not his mimicry, his improvisation, or his humor, but his heart. A heart big enough to see those the world turned away. A heart rich enough to give without asking anything back. A heart that, though it beats no more, left behind a rhythm the world is still dancing to. So, no, Robin Williams didn't just act. He acted. On every instinct to do good. On every chance to help. On every quiet opportunity to be the kind of rich the world truly needs more of.